Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Daf Nun Bet. Today's stuff is sponsored by Ira and Natanya Slomowitz in loving memory of their father and father-in-law, Harav Shlomo ben Masha v'Harav Dov Tzvi Slomowitz. Okay, we're going to get started with the fifth source against Rava. Okay, we've been having a slew of sources trying to say that Rava is wrong in thinking that Kiddushin, Shalom Surul B'Yah Kiddushin, that cannot be consummated, that the couple is not able to have relations because of some forbidden issue, like not sure which sister betrothed to, and therefore each sister is potentially forbidden to him. So according to Rava, right, that is not considered Kiddushin at all, meaning if the woman wants to go get married, she can just go get married to somebody else. But according to Abaye, we consider Kiddushin, again, misafek. We have to be concerned that maybe there's Kiddushin, in which case she cannot marry anyone else until she gets a divorce from him. That's the major relevance. Again, no one's going to say they can go ahead and get married, but because you can't get married if you can't have relations. But they will say that misafek, you have to get divorced. So source number 5 lines from the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Bet. So what we saw yesterday was 4 sources, 4 Mishnayot, and each time we said this really isn't the same situation. Okay, and therefore we can't question Rava from this. So Tashma, we're going to do the same thing in this one. Shnaim shekidshu shtei achayot, 2 brothers betrothed 2 sisters. David and Moshe betrothed Rachel and Leah. Zeino Yodeh is a Kiddush, V'zeino Yodeh is a Kiddush. You could already tell we're not going to be able to answer like the last one. The last few we answered saying it must be a case where this one we can. Sorry, my mistake. So neither one, erase what I just said a second ago, neither one knows which one he betrothed, meaning he betrothed one of them, but he's not sure anymore which one. So David and Moshe betrothed each of them, Rachel and Leah, but neither knows which one. So now, zenoten shni gitim v'zenoten shni gitim. Each one needs to give a get, which means the Kiddushin was valid. Now, why was the Kiddushin valid? If each one isn't sure which one he betrothed, then neither Kiddushin should have been valid because neither one is allowed to be in this relationship with Leah or with Rachel. They can't have relations with them because perhaps they're actually betrothed to the sister and not to them. And then the sister's forbidden. To which the Gemara answers, sorry, this one is exactly like the previous, which is, hachinami shokru levasof nitarvu. And dakanami dekatani eino yodea velo katani ein yadua shmamina. Again, listen to the language. It says they each betrothed these women and they don't know which one. That doesn't mean they didn't know at the time. It means they knew at the time of the betrothal. Meaning, let's say David betrothed Rachel, and Moshe betrothed Leah, but now neither one remembers which one betrothed to. Okay, maybe that you have to assume if we're talking about either this is just purely theoretical or the way they did Kiddushin, clearly it was different than the way we do it. And it's possible maybe they all did it together and then they were just confused which girl was the one they betrothed to which guy. So it's not a case, obviously, where they fell in love and then, this was who they were planning to marry out of falling in love with them. Then they'd obviously know which one. So now they basically say, don't worry, because the case was they knew at the time, they just forgot after, which means the Kiddushin itself was valid because at the time he was able to have relations with her potentially because he knew exactly who it was. Only the confusion came in later. Daikan, and this was what we answered in the press too as well. So now they say, well, if that's the case, same like we asked the last 2 times, so what is this Mishnah trying to teach us? This is quite obvious. To which they answer, as they answered in the previous, you're right. It is very obvious. But remember, this is a Mishnah in Yevamot. So the Mishnah in Yevamot wasn't coming to tell us that first line about get and Kiddushin, because that's not the topic in Yevamot. That was just the introduction to the main part of the Mishnah, which is the following. They needed to set that up to get to the second part. What was the second part? If Moshe and David both die, and now we're left with these 2 women, Rachel and Leah, and they don't know who they're supposed to do yibum and chalitza with because they don't know who they were betrothed to. Well, if each Moshe and David have one brother, so we already learned this. It's the same as the previous. It's the same idea. Each one has one brother. Since each brother doesn't know, am I supposed to do yibum with this one or with that one? So since there's a concern, maybe, right, he can't, let's say, do yibum with Leah because maybe he's actually supposed to do yibum with Rachel, and you're not allowed to do yibum with achot kato, right, the sister of the one you're supposed to do yibum with. So each one has to do chalitza to both because each one, and it's okay, now we have this issue, 2 issues. Number one, we have the issue at the beginning, the brother of David can't do yibum with Rachel, because maybe he's actually supposed to do yibum with Leah. Once he does chalitza with Rachel, now Leah's left. Now you no longer have a problem of achot zkukato, but now you have a problem. Once you do chalitza, you're not allowed, the rabbis, these are both rabbinic institutions, you're not allowed to do yibum with the sister of a woman you did chalitza with, because it's like, even though it's not, but if you say chalitza is similar to divorce, which we said with the kohen, right? You can't marry a chalutza, just like you can't marry a grusha. Also, we're going to say here, we forbid the sister of someone you did chalitza with, even though you were never really married to the sister, you still can't marry her. So therefore, each brother, we have one brother of each. There's only one brother. That brother has to do chalitza to each. Both brothers do chalitza to both women. But if David had one brother, but Moshe had two brothers, so then okay, the one who has one brother, David had one brother, so that one brother does chalitza to both of them, just like we said. Because again, can't do to the first one because achot zkukato. Can't do to the second one because she's the sister of the chalutza. But the one who has two brothers, since you don't have the achot chalutza problem, echad choletz ve'echad miyabem. One can do chalitza and one can do yibum. In other words, the first brother does chalitza, and that's what we're going to see soon, right? And the second brother does yibum. Because at that point, we've resolved all the issues. And either she's nobody because she wasn't married to his brother, in which case he can marry her, or she's the one you're supposed to do chalitza with, yibum with, and therefore you could do yibum with her. There's no more a problem of achot zkukato, and there's no problem of achot chalutzato because he didn't do chalitza. The brother did chalitza. He didn't do chalitza. And achot zkukato, well, the other one is already dealt with. She already has chalitza, so there's no problem. In kadmu v'kinsu, but if they both married, then emotziino tamiyadam, right? Then it's okay if they both married her because all these issues are only rabbinic. So if they did it anyway, you can leave them married, one to each, and it works. Now, what we said before, one choletz, one miyabem, it has to be in that order. But you can't do yibum first and then chalitza because perhaps she's the one, this is with the two, we have two different sets of the brothers of David and the brother of Moshe, or brother of David, brothers of Moshe, it doesn't matter which one. But you can't do yibum first before the other brother, the brother of the other one, the other husband does chalitza, because it could be that she's actually the yivama of the other guy. And then you have a problem of marrying a yivama who, maybe she wasn't your brother's wife. She was the other guy's wife and he hasn't taken care of it. So you can only do the yibum after the chalitza is done by the other guy. Okay, that was source number 5. That was a good review of all sorts of things we learned in Yevamot. Tashma, 6th and final source, and this source in the end we will not have an answer to Rava. And this is the case where I started to accidentally say before, you will not be able to say that it was how did we say it? What's the wording? Huklu ulevasof nidarvu. It's not going to be a case where they knew it in the beginning and then got mixed up, and you'll see why immediately. And then we're going to be stuck. Detane tavume. Okay, this is a bit of a crazy situation. Okay, it sounds like the Partridge Family. Okay, there's 5 sons in this family. There's 5 daughters in that family. And Amar echat mi benotecha mikudeshet lacha mi banai. And one father, the father of the daughters, gets up and goes to the father of the sons and says, I am betrothing one of my daughters to one of your sons. Okay? And the other guy agrees and they do a Kiddushin without specifying. That's why this case is crazy. What was he thinking? Okay, but obviously he didn't know enough. And he basically created this huge problem because now we have 5 girls who are potentially all betrothed to one of 5 sons. How do we get out of this? And remember, this is, if we say it's Kiddushin Shalom Surah Biyah, which it is, because no brother can have relations with any of the sisters because there's a concern that he's already betrothed to her sister. So what do we do? So now each man is going to have, each son is going to have to give a get to each of the women. So each woman is going to receive 5 gitin from each of the 5 brothers. Okay, so what do you see already here? This is Kiddushin Shalom Surah Biyah, because there was no way they could have ever consummated this marriage, in which case you see it's Kiddushin because you have to get a get. Okay, not only that, you have to get 5 gets here. Meit echa behem, don't think we're going to avoid a yibum situation here. So what do we do? Meit echa behem, this is at least a very simple yibum situation. Kol echad ve'echad tzricha arba'a gitin. Okay, so first of all, we're left with 4 brothers. So now if the brother who died was not the husband, then each of these 4 brothers is still potentially betrothed to her. So therefore, each one needs to give a get. So each woman's going to get this time only 4 gittin because the dead brother's not around, obviously, to give a get, and obviously doesn't need to give a get if he's dead. But she also potentially might need chalitza because of the dead brother. Because if one of these daughters was the one who was married and it was married to that brother, she need yibum. But you can't do yibum because no brother can do yibum with her because maybe his live brother is married to her, or is betrothed to her, and therefore no. So what do? Chalitza me'echad mehem. This is actually pretty simple. Each one needs chalitza. It actually doesn't matter from which brother. Each brother could do chalitza to a different woman. One guy could do chalitza for all 4. It doesn't really make a difference. But they each need a chalitza to get removed from the possible safek. So they're going to each get a get, and they're each going to get 4 gets and 1 chalitza. Okay, crazy situation. Anyway, the point is, if you want to say here, that it's a case where, right, they knew who it was, and then they knew which daughter to which son, and then they got confused about it. But the father went and said, betroth one of your sons to one of my daughters. So the betrothal clearly happened without any specifications. So you can't say that. In which case, yufta de Rava to yufta. This is a real knockout to Rava's approach. Clearly, he goes against this. And in fact, the halakha is hilchata kavateta Abaye b'ya'al kegam. If you want to learn more, you can read Shuli Mishkan's article this week about Abaye and Rava. Ya'al kegam. Anyway, the halakha is like Abaye in 6 cases. Okay, we'll quickly go through the 6 cases and then we'll move on. But one is yeush shalom midat. Okay, if you find the lost item and you don't know if the owners had yeush or not, is there a way to assume? We'll get to all this in Bava Metzia, but is there a way to assume? Can you assume that if the owner lost something that they immediately give up, their rights to it? In which case, when you find it, it can be yours. Is there such a thing as yeush without us knowing? Can we assume in certain cases there's yeush? Ayin, edim. This is edim zomimim. When edim zomimim are convicted of becoming edim zomimim, they can no longer testify in court. But the question is it from the moment they were convicted as edim zomimim, or does it go back to the moment that they lied falsely in court? There's big machloket about that. We'll get to that in Sanhedrin. Lamid, that we learned in Eruvim, lechi haomei me'elav. Can you use a lechi for an eruv if it's already standing there? Kuf is our case. Gimel, giloi milta beget. We learned that with that famous case about the woman weaving, and then the witness, the shaliach comes to give her the get, and she says, I'm busy now, come back tomorrow. And then he goes and tells the husband says, oh, Baruch Hashem, he said, Baruch HaTov Amiti. And then the question is that mean, is it clear what he meant is, oh, good, because I didn't really want to divorce her, and therefore the get is canceled? Or did it mean possibly, is it not clear enough? He didn't say, you are canceling the get. Maybe it's not considered anything. So that's another machlokah between them. And mem is mumar chel. If you eat non-kosher just because it tastes better and not because you're going against, you're lahachis, they call it, where you're dafka doing it. But no, you're doing it because it tastes better or it's cheaper in the store. So are you disqualified as a witness or not? Okay, so those are 6 cases. Okay, we don't have time to start going, who says what and what do we hold? But these are 6 cases, the only 6 cases where we actually hold like Abaye against Rava. Okay, generally we hold like Rava. Rava is generally known, kind of like the Beit Shammai thing, to be the more harmonious opinion. Okay, we're going to actually see a bunch of themes that come up in the beginning of the daf and come up at the end of the daf. This will come up at the end of the daf also, that we often paskin like the one who not necessarily has the strongest truth, but is more harmonious in their approach. Okay, and that's something that you see more with Rava. Abaye had a rough life and was always, kind of had a tough life and often has tough opinions. Like it doesn't bother him to be more strict about certain things. It's not true across the board, okay, in every single situation. But here, for example, he is being stricter by saying you need a get, right? In Kiddushin Shalom Surah L'Biyah. So anyway, in 6 cases we pass like, well, Abaye, why in those 6 cases? It's a really good question. Okay, going back to our Mishnah, maaser bechamesh nashim. Okay, so now there's a case in the Mishnah. Let's just review it. Okay, we'll go back to Nun Amud and read the case because we're going to derive 4 halakhot from the details that were given in this case. Seem like strange details to be receiving. Rav is going to say, well, since they're giving all these strange details, you can infer all sorts of things from this halakha. So this guy came. There were chamesh nashim, ubehen shtei achayot. There were 5 women there. 2 of them were sisters. And what happened? Liket adam echad kala shel teinim. He took a basket full of figs that were from the field of these women. Vishalahenaita belonged to them. Vishal shvi'itaita, but it was the shemita year. So what does that mean? That means they were ownerless. That means he could acquire them from the hefker, as we call them. They're ownerless. And then he took them for himself. And then he said, Amar harei kolchem mekudashot li betil kalaso. He said, I'm going to betroth you with this basket of figs. Vikibla achat mehen al yidei kulam. One accepted on behalf of all of them. And then the rabbi said, Ein achayot mekudashot. It works for the three, but not for the two sisters. And that's where we got off on the whole, because it's Kiddushin Shalom Mesur L'Biyah, therefore it's not Kiddushin. But we did say that the Mishnah could be interpreted according to Rava as well. I'm not going to go back there, but there was a way to read the Mishnah like Rava, even though the simple reading seemed to be like Abaye. That was, again, one of the first question we brought on Rava was from our Mishnah. So Amara, Shmamina, Mimanitin Arba. Rav says you can derive 4 halakhot from this Mishnah. V'naki Rabbi Yadetla, but he only held by 3 of them. One of them he wasn't willing to conclude definitively, and that I already kind of alluded to a second ago, because I said whether you learn from here Kiddushin and Surul Biyah or not is a machloket about how to read the Mishnah. So probably because of that, he wasn't willing, and we'll see that in the Gemara further on. Shmamina. So let's go through our list of 4. Number 1, hamikadesh beperot shvi mikudeshet. You can betroth a woman, a man can betroth a woman with shemita produce. Now, why would you think you can't? Well, right, because he acquired ownership of it. But if you remember, shemita produce is meant for you to eat. Now, usually we mean to eat and not to sell. But it could be to eat means you can really only eat it. For example, you're not supposed to do unusual things with the fruits. Like if it's something that you never make shakes out of, you're not allowed to make shakes out of it, okay? Like there's certain ways you can handle Kedusha, like they have Kedusha to them, inherent sanctity. So perhaps it's only for eating and you can't use it to betroth a woman. To which they say, it's clear from our Mishnah that you can, because that was the case. He betrothed these women and the betrothal was valid, even though it was shemita produce. Number 2, Shmamina, kitcha begezel enim kudesh. If he actually stole it, it wouldn't work. Stolen produce cannot be used to betroth a woman, which you might think sounds pretty simple, but we'll see it's not necessarily so simple, like obvious meaning. So now they say, afilu begezel dida, even if he stole it from her. Now, why would it make a difference if he stole it from her or not? Because imagine a man steals something from a woman, and then he gives it back to her to betroth her. We actually talked about this in the beginning of the Masechet, and we'll quote this again later on. He betroths her with stolen property. It could be that at that moment she's happy to accept the Kiddushin, and she's willing to say, yeah, I don't care that it's my stolen item. You can keep it and now give it to me as a gift. Okay? So, and that she's willing, maybe you would think, well, no, not according to this. Mimai, from where do we learn this? Well, it doesn't actually say that in the Mishnah, but what does it tell us? Because it says it was their produce, but it was the Shemitah year, would imply Tama de Shvi'it, de Hefker, that it only works because it was Shemitah, and the Shemitah produce was ownerless, which meant he could acquire it for himself. But if it was from any other year of the Shemitah cycle, and it was theirs, and he took it, it sounds like it wouldn't work. Like it only worked because it was Shemitah. Yeah. Ushmamina. 3rd halakha. If you remember, one woman accepted the betrothals on behalf of all the others. Now, that means that all the other women, or at least the ones it's going to work for, other than the 2 sisters, are now going to become her rival wives. Now, generally, we don't trust rival wives about testifying about their other rival wives, because there's usually a lot of animosity between them and competition, and they like to mess each other up, or at least there's potential that they might. So therefore, we don't accept their testimony, for example. But this isn't testimony. This is accepting Kiddushin on behalf of the other. There's witnesses that witness the Kiddushin. So because it's not an issue of believability, she can do this for her rival wife. There's no problem. V'idachmai, what about the 4th? Kiddushin she'em in L'Biyah. So if that's the 4th thing you can derive from here. V'nichshava, why doesn't he put it on the list? To which I told you already, because Rav wasn't sure how to read the Mishnah, the way Rava reads it or the way Abaye reads it. Again, the simple reading is Abaye, but it could be read according to Rava as well. And therefore, he didn't say, I paskin halakha that way. Now we're going to go back to this Kiddushin with stolen items. So we have 4 halakhot. What we did so far is we had 2 more sources against Rava. We knocked out one. We concluded with the last one that we really have a difficulty with Rava. We conclude that we paskin like Abaye here and in 5 of the cases. Then we bring up our case in our Mishnah, and Rav derives from here 4 halakhot, of which he's only willing to hold by 3 of them, because the 4th he's not clear about. You have to remember, Rav came before Abaye and Rava. But what we mean is, right, he already, before Abaye and Rava said it and had this whole halakhot about it, he obviously was thinking about it as well and thought about the fact that the Mishnah could go in two ways on this issue. Now we're going to go back to halakha number 2, kidsha begezel, which it sounded like it never works, and it's clear it doesn't work. What's the problem? Kisalak Rabbi Zera. So first we get to one thing, which is a story about Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera made aliyah. If you remember, famous story with him and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda didn't want him making aliyah. He makes aliyah anyway. When he makes aliyah, he goes and tells Rav's halakha to Rabbi Yochanan. So he says, Kudesh begezel doesn't work. Rabbi Yochanan says, Mi amar Rav hachi, did Rav really say this? Now, what does he mean when Rav really said this? And this is another theme. There's a bunch of things that are going to come up a few times in the daf in other contexts, where somebody says something and do they really mean what they say? So when he says, or there's two ways to understand this statement. So right now they understand it means, did Rav really say this? Meaning, no way, no how. Do we say, Mekudesha begezel and Mekudesha? To which the Gemara says, V'hulo amar, doesn't Rabbi Yochanan hold the same thing? V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say, didn't he say, Gazal v'lo nitiashu abalim shnehem enam yicholim l'kadesh. If David stole money from Moshe, okay, and then David takes this money he stole and betroths Rachel with it. So he can't do that. If Moshe hasn't given up hope of getting his item back, then that item is not belonging to David at all. In which case, he can't go ahead and betroth Rachel with it because it's not his. You know, under the chuppah, the rabbi always asks, or the person running the chuppah always asks, did you buy this ring? Is it yours? Did you pay for it with your own money? Like, there's a whole issue. It has to be yours, kind of like the lulav on the first day. So anyway, it's not his to do. Now, if Moshe wants to betroth Rachel with this stolen item that now is in David's possession, even though it belongs to Moshe and it's got his name on it, but it's not in his possession, he also can't betroth with that. Now, that's not relevant to our issue, but it's just another interesting point that Rabbi Yochanan happened to say in this context. It's not in his domain. It might be Moshe's object, but David stole it right now, so Moshe doesn't have it in which to give it to her. So therefore, what do you see here? Rabbi Yochanan actually agrees with Rav. So why would he be so surprised to say, does Rav really say this? Why would he say that if he himself holds that way? Sounded like he doesn't agree with him. And that's why I said, what, did Rav really say such a crazy thing? Can't possibly be. Rabbi Yochanan says the same crazy thing. So it doesn't make any sense. To which the Gemara says, Hachi Kamala, you misunderstood it. Mi amar Rav kavati. Okay, it's all about the tone in which he said it. He said, oh, did Rav say like me? Wow, good for me. Rav, agree with me. That's so nice. Okay, and that was his response, and not, did Rav really say such a thing? Meitive. Remember this about a statement that could be understood, right, almost sarcastically or rhetorically, or, you know, there's all different ways to understand the way somebody says something. Okay, later we'll get to sarcasm. This wasn't really sarcastic. It was more like antagonistic. You know, did Rav really say that? Or as a very positive thing. Did Rav say that? How nice. Meitive. But now they're going to bring a contradiction against both Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. And we saw this in the beginning of the Masechet. If you betroth someone with stolen property, whether it was stolen or it was chamas, where you kind of stole it but left the money for them, ubegneva, right? Gneva and gzela, we won't get into all the differences now. We'll get to that in Baba Kama. Or he grabbed a sela out of her hand and gave it back to her and betrothed her with it. Mikudeshet. This works. How could this work? We just said it doesn't. To which they say, oh no, that braita was begezel dida. That braita was talking about if he stole from her. If he stole from her, chances are she was willing to give up on the right. So this braita that says it works is when he steals from her. Now, obviously we have a bit of a problem because Rav said even if he steals from her, but we'll get back to that. So first we're going to say if he steals from her, it's a different story. By the way, this whole thing with stealing from her, there's a debate about how this works exactly. So again, what happens? I'm about to get betrothed. This guy stole from me and now he wants to give it back to me. And he says to me, listen, I'm giving this back to you as a betrothal. And I basically, in my mind, I say, okay, I guess I'm giving up on the fact that you stole it from me. I won't get it back as a stolen item. I'm just going to get it back as a gift. And because I'm mochelet, right, I say, it's okay. You don't have to give me back a stolen item. It basically becomes yours. And then you give it to me as a gift and then it works, or his, right, the husband, and then he gives it to me as a gift. But what's the issue here? So first of all, it's a little weird, but he doesn't have to return the stolen item. So some people say, that's what happens is when there's yeush ba'alim, what does that mean? If you steal something from me, okay, forget about betrothal. You steal something from me. We generally say this was called at a certain point, I don't think I'm ever going to get it back because I know they'll never find you. So I'm mityaesh. I give up on ever getting it back. At that point, you have a certain amount of ownership over it. Now, we'll see this a little bit later. If you, let's say, give it to someone else, they can actually acquire it because there's been yeush. I don't own it anymore because I've given up rights to it. And you now have changed the domain of it. Once you do that, it already actually leaves being considered a stolen item. And they actually can acquire the item, at least according to many opinions. But what happens here? The issue is, though, what do you mean? The item, there's the status of the item, and then there's your obligation of returning stolen objects. So even though you might acquire the object or it might leave my domain, you still owe me money. So some commentaries say here, what it means is that she's mochelet. She's not mochelet the financial issue. She's mochelet getting it back from him as a returning of the stolen item. But he still, let's say the item cost $100, he still has to pay her the $100 and return the money he owes her for it. Okay, that's what happens when we switch ownership. You might own the object as a robber in certain situations, but you still owe the money. It doesn't mean you owned it and it became yours and great. Like, look, I won because I'm a robber and now it's mine. You obviously have to return the money. So some of the commentaries say here, what we mean in this situation is some people think she's mochelet on the whole thing and he doesn't actually have to return her anything. Some people say, no, he still needs to return her the $100 because he stole the $100 from her. Okay, so don't think he's getting away with that. But anyway, that's really an aside. So let's get back to our topic. So what do we say? That's when he stole it from her. And then it works. I say, wait, that doesn't make any sense to say that because this case gave 3 cases in the beginning, stole, right, gezel, chamas, kneva, and then it said, or he stole it from her. So it sounds like it sounds like the first part wasn't from her. To which the Gemara answers, no. It's actually, second part is coming to just define the first part. We've seen this actually very recently, where it looks like it's 2 different things, but really the second part is coming to define the first. In what situation? When would it work? If it were a case where he stole it from her. Because again, if he steals from someone else, she can't, in accepting it, say, oh, you don't have to pay back that lost item. You know, she has no rights to do that. It wasn't her stolen item. It wasn't stolen from her. But when it's her, she could do it. So that sounds like a good resolution, although we're going to have a major problem with it. But moving now to Amabet. So now what do we have? We have, he said, if the braita is talking about where he stole from her, and Rav was talking about where he stole from somebody else. So if he steals from her, it works. If he stole from someone else, it doesn't work. But remember, what was the case in the Mishnah? Hamanitin de gazal dida, v'ka'amar Rav ena mekudeshet. But the Mishnah, and Rav even said it explicitly, the Mishnah was a case where he stole from them. Remember, it was all an inference. He stole from them. He didn't really steal from them because it was shemita year and therefore it was ownerless. But infer from there that if it wasn't ownerless and it really belonged to them, it wouldn't work, even though he was stealing from them, from the women he was betrothed. So how can you possibly say that our Mishnah, right, the inference from our Mishnah, Rav's halakha, is not about stealing from her? It clearly is. So they suggest a different distinction, which would be a distinction within stealing from specifically the woman and returning it. If it was a case where they already had an arrangement that they were getting betrothed, and then he returns her an item he stole from her, then it would work. But if they hadn't made any arrangement about Kiddushin, and he steals an item from her, and then he gives it back to her before Kiddushin, when they've never discussed Kiddushin at all, then it wouldn't work. Because then, in other words, it's all a matter of, do we assume the woman gave up her rights to the item? So if they had already discussed betrothal, then it makes sense that she'd given up her rights. If they hadn't discussed betrothal before, then it doesn't make sense she'd given up her rights. And that's, in the end, the distinction they make between the braita and Rav. It's not the strongest answer, but it is a possible answer. So this section of the Mishnah, what have we done? We took 4 halakhot that Rav infers from our Mishnah. The 4th one, we said he wasn't clear about, though, which direction to go in. He just said this is something you could derive from our Mishnah, Kiddushin Shem Sirim Libiyah, but you could go either way with it. All the others he derived clearly. Then we brought this issue of Rav's halakha being brought by Rabbi Zeir in front of Rabbi Yochanan. In the end, we said Rabbi Yochanan was saying, oh, wow, great, he says like me. And then we had this one question, a contradiction to Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, really, about the Kidsha Begezel. It seems to yes work. And then we defined in which case does it work, in which case doesn't it work. Now we're going to have 3 cases where someone took a stolen item or somewhat stolen item. We'll see. and used it to betroth the woman. And all these cases came up in front of Rava, to a court of Ravas, and Rava ruled in all these cases. So let's see what he says. There was a woman to have a kamash yakara b'mishcha. She was bathing her, she was washing her feet off in a basket of water, in something of water. Atahu gavra. Okay, a guy sees her. I don't know why specifically they tell us she was bathing her legs in water, but anyway, in a basin of water. But anyway, this guy comes over. Chatav zuzim, he sees her, he wants to get betrothed to her. So what does he do? It reminds me a little bit of those stories when he goes into the store and he sees the woman and he tries to pick her up. So in this case, but this is different because in this case, she's actually going to accept the betrothal. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be a question. Chatav zuzim echavle, he grabs money from his friend. In other words, he walked out without his wallet and he basically sees this woman, wants to betroth her. So grabs money, steals money from his friend, ushadela, and he gives to her. Amar la mikadesh, at least says, you're betrothed to me. And she obviously accepts. Atahu gavra l'kamei de Rava. He comes before Rava and says, am I betrothed or not? Amar leit dechash lahad Rabbi Shimon de Amal stam gzeli ba'alim having. So first let's understand Rabbi Shimon and then we'll see what Rava says about it. Rabbi Shimon held that if you steal an item, you can assume that the owner had yeush. Okay? If you don't know whether the owner gave up his rights, you can assume they did. Comes Rava and says, nobody holds like Rabbi Shimon. Meaning, you have no idea if the owner thought he was ever going to gave up his rights to the money that you stole from him, in which case, there's no way. Now, what would happen in that case? Let's say the owner gave up his rights. If the owner gave up his rights, there would be yeush. And what did I tell you before? That if there's yeush and shinoi ba'alin, that you moved it into someone else's possession, it would actually become theirs. So what would happen in this case? The owner would have been mityaesh, given up the rights of ever getting it back. Now comes the thief, and he gives it to the woman. That's called shinoi reshut. So yeush and shinoi reshut should make it hers, but that's only if there's yeush. Comes Rava and he says, we can't assume there's yeush. That guy might have thought he could still get this money back from the one who stole it, and therefore it wasn't yours to give, and therefore it doesn't become hers, and therefore she's not betrothed. Next case, hahu arisa. Now we're getting into a sharecropper. We're going to have three totally different situations. The first was just a random man on the street, find someone else and steal some money. Now we get to a sharecropper. Now, what is a sharecropper? So exactly as it sounds. You work on the land, and then you get a percentage of the produce. So the produce in this field, if you steal it, well, is it stolen or not really stolen? Because in the end, some of it actually is going to belong to you. So there was an aris, de kaddish b'moza de shamche. He took a bunch of random onions from the field and betrothed her with it. Now, they weren't his because they were the owner of the fields. On the other hand, again, he's supposed to get a percentage of the produce. He goes before Rava and asks, am I betrothed with this? Amarle, manachalech. Who gave you mechila? Who told you it's okay to take onions from the field? Meaning, no, you're not betrothed. You stole it. But the Gemara says, Hani mile, this is only bimoza, if you took random onions. Aval kisha, but if you took a bag full or apparently a bundle of onions, okay? Now, they would bundle onions. Now, what's the difference between taking random onions and bundle onions? Well, random onions, there could be a gigantic one. There could be a teeny one, right? We always sell by weight, okay? But they also sold by bundle. So if you had a bundle, okay, a bundle of onions costs X amount. Nowadays, it wouldn't really be true. Usually you'd weigh it anyway. But assume a bundle, even nowadays, you could go like there's certain stores, they sell them and they're all about the same amount. If it was a bundle you took of a kisha, that's kisha here, matze amarle, he could say to the owner, ana shakla kisha, shakil at kisha, kisha ki kisha. He could say, it's a funny line, but it sounds very funny. But he said, what he's saying is, if it was a bundle, he could later go and say, listen, I took a bundle and now you take a bundle, right? I get a third. So you take two bundles to my one bundle and we can divide it up evenly later, even though I took it now. That would work. But if it's random onions, who knows how big they were, how small they were, what they weighed, how much they would have cost. We can't later say, oh, look, I took two onions. That doesn't really help. So there won't be a way to calculate how to divide it. So therefore, it would work if it was a bundle. It wouldn't work if it was individual onions. Halusarsia, third case. The Kaddish bepruma de shichra. We now have a guy who works in a brewery making beer. Now, what happens with the beer is at the end, you're left with the sediment of the dates. They would make date beer at the bottom of the pot. So now, or whatever they make of it. So now, atamari de shichra. So what did he do? He took the sediment from the bottom of the vat. Thank you. He took the sediment from the bottom of the vat and he betrothed the woman with this sediment. Okay, if you thought it was bad enough, the woman who got the date and ate it, right? This is really pretty bad. So he took the sediment and he betrothed her with those dates. Atamare de shikra. Okay, now we talked before about the guy who said, did Rava really say, Rabbi Yochanan who said, did Rav really say that? And it could have been understood in two different ways. Here we get to the real sugya where it talks about how to understand what somebody says. So the owner of the dates hears what happened. Eshkachei sees what happened. Why don't you give her from the better sediment, the one that was stronger, sharper? In other words, there was sediment on the other side that was actually much better. Should it in kvar kvar, the way they say in Hebrew, right? If you were already going to do it, you may as well have done it nicer. Now, the question is, does that mean I agree that it was okay that you did it and it's fine, it was yours to take? Onto the comment of Rava. So he goes before Rava. Amal, lo amru kalechet sal yafot ela liyan truma b'lvad. Okay, this is a whole big one sentence that means a lot, and we're going to see it all now. From here till the end of the Mishna is going to be about that, until the end of the section. When you say kalechet sal yafot, okay, which is a term that could be defined in two different ways, we could define it as there was agreement on, okay, what is it? It's hard to say this without reading the whole thing, but let me try to define it very quickly, and then we'll see it inside. If you take truma for somebody else, okay, you come into my field and you decide to take truma for me. Okay, actually, I'm not even going to define these words until we get into the braita, because then we'll see it all. I don't want to repeat myself and read it a million times, so I'll just read it inside in the braita. But what basically the answer is, this would only be defined in a positive way by truma and not in this case. Meaning, Rava again says, no, you stole this. This wasn't yours to take, and it doesn't work, even though you might think in that statement, the owner's kind of saying, oh, not only was it okay, you took that, you should have taken something better. We don't view his statement as meaning that. Okay, and then we're going to say, well, what did his statement mean? That will be the last line of the Gemara here before we get to the Mishna. So now let's see what kalechet sal yafot means regarding truma. We've actually seen this before. So now, what do we say? Actually, maybe we didn't see it before. I see it's in Bava Metzia. Okay. Ditanya, it says in a braita, Ketzad amru torem shalom midat trumato truma. In what case do we say that someone who gives truma, okay, so again, you go into my field and you take truma from my produce without my permission. Now, truma, if you remember, there's a range of what you could give. And there's also an issue of, do you give your nicest fruits, right? We all know there's fruits that are, top, there's fruits that are in the middle, there's fruits that are bad looking. I want to choose which I want to give to truma, not you. So if you come into my field and you take my truma, to a certain extent, you've done me a favor, because now I don't have to deal with doing the truma. It's a bit of a headache. On the other hand, maybe it's not what I wanted. So we have to assess what I really wanted in this case. So how do we do that? We see my reaction to what you did. So if you took shalom midat, it actually works. Okay, in what way? Okay, so you come into my field, you take some produce to give to the kohen instead of me without my permission. Now, okay, this is a Tosefta, by the way. So now it says, if we're concerned about theft, then it doesn't work. If we're not concerned about theft, then it does work. What on earth does that mean? They don't know. So now they're going to say, how do we know that we're concerned that you stole or that you didn't steal? And what's stealing? It's all a matter of, was I happy with what you did or was I not happy with what you did? So if I wasn't happy, then it's basically you stole from me. And therefore it doesn't work. It's not true. If I agreed with you, then it works. How do we know if I agree with you or not? Well, here's a particular scenario. So I saw you took, and I see the pile of what you took as truma. Now I say to you, you should have taken nicer produce. Now that could mean itself in the opposite. That could mean, why didn't you take the best of my produce? In other words, you took the middle level, it's not such nice produce. I would have been much happier to give the kohen the nicer produce. Possibly, I mean that. Or possibly, I mean, you took my nicest produce. What are you, crazy? What? Why didn't you give him my better stuff? Meaning, why on earth did you give him my best stuff? So how do we know what you mean? So they say the following. We check your field, compare it to the produce that you took. If I actually do have better produce, then we assume that what I meant was you should have taken from my better produce. And I meant it seriously, which means that even though I'm not happy that you didn't take from my better produce, I actually approve of what you did. I'm happy you took that. I would have been even happier if you had given my nicest stuff, but obviously I'm not upset that you took it. Truma to truma. Vim lav, but if I don't have nicer produce, and basically I'm saying, why on earth did you take from my best produce? Well, since that's not what I would have wanted, and you took something more than what I would have given, ain't trumato truma. It doesn't work. Now let's go back to the beginning. And then there's one more point before we go back to the beginning. If I added to it, let's say you took X amount and I decided to give more, well, then obviously, it doesn't matter whether I have nicer or I don't have nicer. And I said, take from my nicer stuff. Obviously, I'm approving of what you're doing because I'm just adding more to it. I'm saying, obviously, I'm okay with what you did and I'm actually giving more. Then trumato would be truma. Now, let's go back to the original line. They only say that is a determining factor. We look and see, do I have better stuff or do I not have better stuff to determine if I really was happy with it or not. That's only by truma. Why? Because in truma, you're doing something for me. But with the sediment at the bottom of the vat of the beer, you are stealing my sediment to go betroth a woman with it. That's not I have no interest in that at all. And therefore, halakhot, the question is, what did I mean when I said, why don't you take from the better stuff? I was just trying not to humiliate you. But, it's kind of humiliating when everyone realizes that you stole from me. So I made this nice statement to make it sound like, oh, you should have taken something nicer just not to humiliate you in front of everybody else. But really, I wasn't approving of the fact that you took my stuff. And therefore, you're not betrothed. That's what Rava said. That was a very long-winded way to get to his answer. Okay, so 3 cases where Rava basically says all these are going to be considered stolen property. And again, one was just a random person stealing. One was a sharecropper who sort of wasn't stealing, but it sort of was, right? Again, then we sort of said depended on the situation. And the third, even though that situation specifically didn't work, and the third was the worker taking the sediment from the bottom of the vat. Okay, next Mishna. This Mishna we're going to read, it has 3 parts. Part 2 and part 3, we're going to barely understand today. Very complicated. We're going to understand in the next few dapim. Case 1 is going to be our focus for today. So I'll read the Mishnah pretty quickly in terms of case 2 and 3. We'll really deal with them later. And it's one of those cases where whenever Rashi says, Lekama mefaresh, it means, right, we'll explain this all later. Even Rashi doesn't want to tell you what it means because it's just too complicated to go into. So for our case also, we'll stick with Rashi on that. HaMekadesh bechelko. If a kohen takes the parts of the sacrifices that go to the kohen, and they split up into ones that are kochim kalim and kochim kochim. Kochim kochim are higher sanctity. They can only be eaten in the azara. Kochim kalim can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem. They're lower sanctity. Either which way, if he's mekadesh bechelko, he takes the part that he got given, and he betroths a woman with it. This is kind of like the shemita, remember? He could betroth with the shemita, even though it's not really, right? It's lit ochla, right? It's for eating, but we do allow you to do Kiddushin with it. But when it comes to sacrificial meat or items, that stuff belongs to God, really, okay? You're able to eat it as a kohen because God lets you eat it, but it's not yours to go betroth a woman with it. Maaser sheni, where does maaser sheni fit in? If you have the second tithe you're supposed to bring to the temple and eat it in Jerusalem, is it yours or is it God's? So there's a machloket. Ben b'shogeg, ben b'mezid, lo hekdesh. Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says it doesn't matter whether you did it accidentally, you didn't realize it was maaser sheni, or you did it intentionally. This is belonging to God. So you can't, it's not yours to betroth. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'shogeg lo hekdesh, b'mezid hekdesh. Okay, we'll get to this distinction, why he distinguishes, but basically Rabbi Yehuda thinks it's yours to do, so you could if it was intentional. If it was unintentional, it doesn't work. We'll get to why that is later. Hekdesh, what if it was sanctified items? Now here, there's an issue because of Me'ilah. When you misuse sanctified items, you actually turn them into chulin. The question is just when, and we have 2 different approaches, which will be very complicated. We'll get into later about hekdesh. B'mezid kidesh b'shogeg lo kidesh. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'shogeg kidesh b'mezid lo kidesh. They have the actual total opposite about whether it works intentional or unintentional. As I said, we're going to put this aside and explain this all later. Now the Gemara says, Nema manitin to loka Rabbi Yosi Aglili. It seems like the Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yosi Aglili. Again, we're talking about the first part. The kohen gets his part from the sacrifice. Remember, he gets like the chazen, the shok, for example, from the shlemin. So he wants to betroth a woman with it. He can't. Why not? Well, this sounds like it doesn't hold by Rabbi Yosi, because Rabbi Yosi says, Umala mal b'Hashem. This is in the case of Shuata Pikadon. This is, you claim I have something of yours in my possession. I say I do not, and I take an oath about it. And it turns out I lied. So I have to bring a korban shvuah. Now, in the pasuk about normally that would be items that belong to you that are in my possession. So it says there, Mala mal b'Hashem. Now, what does mal b'Hashem have anything to do with this? This is between man and man. What does God come in here? They say, Rabbi Yosi Aglili says if it's the lower level sanctity, like the chazen and the shok, let's say, which come from the shlamim, which is kochim kali, that's really considered mine. So if, or yours, let's say, so let's say your animal is in my possession and it was designated for a korban, and you say, or the chazan, the shok of yours is in my possession. According to Rabbi Yosi Aglili, if I lie about it and I say it's not, that's between me and you, and it's not a moment of God, it's yours. So I would have to bring a sacrifice. To which the Gemara says, no, you misunderstood. And then our Mishnah wouldn't match, because our Mishnah says it's God's, not yours. So afilu tema Rabbi Yosi Aglili, ki ka'amar Rabbi Yosi Aglili mechayim, aval achar shchita lo, my time, ki kazach v'shulchan gavoa kazach. Says the following. There's two different stages of kochim kalim. There's the animal before it's sacrificed. It has sanctity to it. But that is still considered in your possession, according to Rabbi Yosi Aglili. So if you give me your animal to watch, and I lie and I say you never gave it to me, I would have to bring a korban for that. Okay, I'd be liable. But if it's the chazan, the shok, that you got after the korban was already sacrificed, once it's sacrificed, it belongs to God. Even the parts that go to you belong to the kohen, belong to God. So therefore, that's the distinction here. Rabbi Yosi Aglili was talking about the earlier stage, and this is talking about the later stage. In which case, we can have our Mishnah work even according to Rabbi Yosi Aglili. Daikanami dekatane, and there's even further proof in the words of the Mishnah. Hamikadesh bechelko ben bekochikoch ben bekochikalim lo kidesh mamina. What does it say with your portion? Your portion doesn't mean the animal. Your portion means the portion you got after they divided up the portions among the kohen. Now we get to a story, and this story was told with a different halakha in Nazir, so it might sound very familiar. You'll probably remember it. After Rabbi Meir died, Amar lahem Rabbi Yehuda latamidav. Rabbi Yehuda says to his students, remember the big rabbis at the time, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yosi, and they're going to all come up in our story. Rabbi Meir dies. Rabbi Yehuda says, Al yikansu tamidei Rabbi Meir lakan. Crazy situation. He says, no, right, you imagine the students of Rabbi Meir, where are they going to go if not to Rabbi Yehuda? I'm closing my Beit Midrash to any of his students. Why? They're just trying to bother me. They don't like me. They want to just pull me down. And what are they going to do? They're not coming here to my Beit Midrash to learn. They're coming to basically provoke me. They want to throw halakhot at me. They want to say, you don't know what you're talking about. And they just want to bug. They just want to provoke. So I'm not letting them into my Beit Midrash. They seal off the doors of the Beit Midrash. Only students of Rabbi Yehuda can come in. Somehow, dachak Sumchus v'nichnas. Sumchus pushes his way in. Amar lahem, remember this wording, okay? Dachak Sumchus v'nichnas. He pushes his way in and goes in. What does he do? He gets up in there and he says, Amar lahem. Notice he's not even talking just to Rabbi Yehuda. Sounds like he's saying this. So he says to them, Kach shanali Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said to me the following. And now he's going to quote our Mishnah. Remember, Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, so it makes sense. HaMekadesh b'chalko ben kochikochim ben kochim kalim lo kidesh. Doesn't work. Ka'as Rabbi Yehuda. He gets very angry by this halakha. Amar lahem lo kach amarti lachem al yikansu mitamidei Rabbi Meir lakam mipnei shekantranim. His mantra. He goes on again, right? I told you they're just trying to provoke me. Why is that? What's wrong with this halakha? What kind of crazy question is this? How could you ever betroth a woman with kochikochim? They could only be eaten in the azara. And women, okay, now here's a good question. Rashi says can't go into the azara. It's forbidden. There's a famous machloket. Tosfot says they can go in. They just never do go in. Okay, you'll never find a woman in the azara. Okay, not because she can't, but because it just wasn't done. Very fascinating as women to understand it's a big machloket. But whether women are allowed in the azara if they have a korban to bring. Okay, no one's allowed in the azara unless they have a korban to bring, unless they're a kohen. But if she has her own korban, is she allowed in the azara or is she not allowed at all? Okay, but that's a whole interesting machloket on the side. But he says, how could you ever have a case of betrothing a woman in the azara with kochikochim? It wouldn't happen. So I told you, they're just trying to bother them. Well, Amar Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi is standing there and he hears what's going on. And he says the following. Yomru, they're going to say, Meir shachav, Yehuda ka'as, Yosi shatak. Rabbi Meir died, Yehuda got angry, and Yosi just was silent. Divrei Torah matei aleim. What is going to happen with the Torah? Rabbi Yosi is obviously a little embarrassed to get up and say something, but he realizes for the sake of peace, he's got to get up and say something. So he says, what are you talking about? First of all, a father can get Kiddushin on behalf of his daughter in the azara. There you have a case of Kiddushin without a woman in the azara. Number two, she can go send a messenger who's a male. Number three, and remember how we started with Sumchus, who pushed his way in, she can push her way in, meaning even if she's not allowed, or even if women don't, you might end up with a case where a woman does anyway, and she pushes her way in, and she could get Kiddushin, and then you have to know what the halakha is. So basically, there's three cases where this could be true. So Why are you making such an issue over this? Now, what is this story about and why we have this whole thing? And it's interesting to think, and maybe we'll wait till tomorrow because the next thing is going to be this braita with a machloket on this issue between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi. And I'll already kind of say it, which is that there's all these rules about who we hold like. And going back to what we said earlier today about Rava, that we usually hold like Rava against Abaye because of his disposition and the way he always tried to be harmonious. Rabbi Yosi was also the harmonizer. And in fact, when it goes Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Yosi against Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yosi against Rabbi Yehuda, we always hold like Rabbi Yosi. Maybe the story is there to tell us why, because even though Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda were these two great gedolim, but Rabbi Yosi was the peacemaker, and that you see from this story. Anyway, maybe we'll have more to say about it tomorrow. So we'll end our daf today over here, and wishing everybody a great day. Moadim l'simcha.